Good evening, United Baptist. Most Americans pray, at least that's what the surveys say. 8 out of 10 Americans say that they pray to God, and half of those say they pray every single day. In fact, a majority of people who never go to church at all say they pray. And if that's true, that means that there are hundreds of millions of prayers going up all the time across America. Of course, something is missing, and a follow-up question to that would be, what are people praying about? Are people praying for revival, a real change in the spiritual climate of America? And some people might say, well, they're just giving those please and thank you prayers. But I'm talking really about Christians too. There's a lot of shocking surveys done about Christians and prayer. Just a few years ago, Barna did a comprehensive study, and they reported their results of Christians praying in America. And they entitled the study, Silent and Solo, How Americans Pray. People's prayer time tends to be something they do by themselves, and it's usually defined by their own immediate concerns. Group prayer, praying with others, is something that is seldom seen in an American Christian's prayer life. And the conclusion of that study was that Christians don't really put a priority of praying with other Christians. Now, the thing about that is in great contrast to church history, and especially the early church. In Acts chapter number 12, we find an amazing example of churches praying together. I think sometimes maybe people push out all the prayer passages in the Bible besides go into your own closet. And they forget that Christians and churches are told to pray together, to come together in prayer. And not only that God does an amazing work during times when people pray. Now, the book of Acts gives us a history of how God grew His church. And while the first church in Jerusalem wasn't a perfect church, it was used mightily of God, and there's a lot to learn from it. In Acts chapter number 12, is a very interesting moment in the Jerusalem church's history. They've been facing a lot of persecution, and James, in fact, had been martyred, killed, because of his Christian testimony and his preaching. And so, it could easily have been a very fearful time in the early Christian church. And this point in Acts chapter number 12, Peter now, the leader in the church, he had been taken and put into prison, and they were sure that he was going to die. James had died. If James was killed, surely Peter would be killed too. In verse 5, it says, Peter therefore was kept in prison, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. Peter wasn't just being, by the way, kept in a county jail. He was locked away in the fortress of Antonia. That was the maximum security place there in Jerusalem. It had been built for the emperor and was right next to the temple, and it housed all kinds of prisoners, that especially those that the Romans deemed religious agitators. Verse number 9, we find this, that Peter is in his cell, and he's sleeping, and then in verse 7 it says, Behold, the angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison, and he smote Peter on the side, and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly. And his chains fell off from his hands. And the angel said unto him, Gird thyself, bind on thy sandals. And so he did. And he saith unto him, Cast thy garments about thee, and follow me. And he went out and followed him, and wist not that it was true, which was done by the angel, but he thought it was a vision. So Peter is getting this rescue attempt, and he really thinks he's just dreaming. He said, now remember, during this time, the church is praying for him. Let me go ahead and jump to verse number 15. Well, actually, let's go to verse 13. So he makes his way now to where the church is praying. And it says, As Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. Now, in many ways, Peter's a fugitive, right? So he's wanting to get into where the church is praying. Rhoda hears the voice, so excited, she runs in where everybody's been praying for him and announces Peter's at the door. Verse 15, And they said unto her, Thou art mad. It's almost like, oh, what are you talking about? God couldn't answer a prayer that fast. But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. Then said they, It is his angel. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. You know, the early Jerusalem church was known for praying together for all kinds of things. It wasn't just in this difficult moment. They were marked by being a people that prayed together. And by the way, the church is called to be a place of prayer. Oftentimes when we read the Bible, we read it as an individual. And so when Paul is speaking about these are things to do, we think he's talking just to us. And we forget that these letters that Paul wrote were written to churches, to congregations of people. And so when he says pray for one another or come and pray together, he's talking to everyone. For instance, in Ephesians chapter number 6, verse 18. Again, written to the church at Ephesus, to a congregation, and he tells them, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. And he is asking for prayer from all of them. Over in Colossians chapter number 4, written to the church at Colossae, we find here, continue in prayer and watching the same with thanksgiving. He is speaking to churches and telling them as they pray together to continue that, to not cease praying. 1 Timothy 2 is another one. He is talking to Timothy here, but he's telling him about what should be done in the churches. He says, I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men. In Colossians 4, verse 2 through 4, it says, continue in prayer and watch in the same with thanksgiving, with all praying also for us, that God would open unto us a door of utterance to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in bonds, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Of course, many people would probably remember that moment where Christ comes into the temple and throws out the money changers. And he says, my house will be called a house of prayer, a place that people come together and pray. What we find in the New Testament is that private-only prayer is not to be what marks a Christian. Sure, we are to pray by ourselves. We're to have our own time with the Lord. But we're also to pray with others. And my challenge for you this evening is to do that. Husbands and wives should pray together. They should spend time together praying out loud for each other's needs, for the needs of their family, for the needs of their church, for the needs of the country. They should spend time together praying. It shouldn't just be something quick for a meal, but it should be a time of great spiritual fellowship between them. Kids should pray with their parents. They should hear their parents pray. And again, not just talking about a quick blessing before the food, but real prayer, that they know that their parents have a relationship with God. Grandkids should hear their grandparents have real times of prayer. And of course, Christians should pray with one another. I think everybody should have a prayer partner. Everybody. A Christian outside of the family that you meet together at times to pray. We find that to be a very common thing that happened within churches and that happened in Christians' lives as you read through the New Testament. Christians are to pray together. I remember kind of the first time that was really impacted in my heart. I was in college at the time, and God really impressed on my heart that I needed to pray with my classmates. And so I remember setting up times with different ones to do that, and it was a real blessing. God does a work when you spend time praying with other Christians, when you value that. And that should be a normal discipline of the Christian life. And so I hope some of these passages and also these events that we looked at this evening will get you to do just that. You don't have to be like the statistics in those surveys. Someone whose prayer life is all within yourself and is not being a blessing to others and also participating with others in the work of prayer. I understand some people are very self-conscious and they don't want anybody hearing them pray, but I want to encourage you to put aside what you think others might think and instead enjoy the fellowship that God calls Christians to have with one another. Nobody has to pray a perfect prayer. Just pray from the heart. So again, my challenge is to begin making it a habit to pray with others, to allow other people to see your heart and what's on it, and it'll be a blessing. Thank you for tuning in. God bless.